The mud on Thomas Grant's boots was 3 days old, and the checkbook in his coat pocket held a number that would make most men weep. Not from joy, from the kind of shame that comes when you realize you're about to spend money that doesn't belong to you, to save a legacy that might already be dead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas stood in the parking lot of Premier Agricultural Equipment, the largest tractor dealership in 3 counties, and stared at the gleaming machines behind the plate glass windows. Each one cost more than his father had made in 5 good years. Each one represented hope, progress, the kind of investment that separated failing farms from thriving ones. And Thomas needed one desperately. He was 52 years old, though the mirror lately suggested 60. His hands were calloused from decades of work that never seemed to end, his face weathered by sun and worry in equal measure. The Grant family had worked the same 600 acres for 4 generations, and Thomas had sworn on his father's deathbed that he would be the one to keep it going. That was 11 months ago. 11 months of watching everything slowly crumble. The old Massey Ferguson that had served them since 1987 had finally died 3 weeks ago, seized up in the middle of spring, planting with half the field still waiting. Thomas had tried everything. He'd replaced parts, called in favors from neighbors, even swallowed his pride and asked his brother-in-law for help. Nothing worked. The tractor was done, and without it, so was the farm. What made it worse was knowing he had the money to fix the problem. Sitting in his checking account was $73,000, a fortune by his standards, money that could buy a good used tractor, pay off some debt, maybe even hire help for harvest. There was just one problem. The money wasn't his. 6 months ago, Thomas's Aunt Margaret had died at 91, the last of her generation. She had been a schoolteacher her whole life, never married, lived simply in the same small house in town for 60 years. When the lawyer read her will, Thomas nearly fell out of his chair. She had left everything to him. Not to his cousins who visited every Christmas, not to the church where she'd played piano for 50 years, to Thomas, because, the letter explained, he was the only one who understood what it meant to be tied to something larger than yourself. The inheritance had been $73,000 in savings bonds and certificates of deposit, accumulated penny by penny over a lifetime of careful living. In her letter, Aunt Margaret had written that she knew the farm was struggling. She knew Thomas would never ask for help, and she wanted him to use the money to save what mattered most, the land, the legacy, the family name. But Thomas hadn't touched a dollar of it. The money sat in the account, untouched, while his tractor rusted and his fields waited. Because using it felt like admitting he had failed, like admitting that 4 generations of Grants hadn't been enough to prepare him for this moment, like taking charity from a woman who had lived on next to nothing so he could keep pretending he was succeeding. His wife Sarah had begged him to use it. His daughter Emily, home from college and watching everything fall apart, had pleaded with him to be practical. Even his best friend Robert, who farmed the adjacent property, had told him he was being a stubborn fool. But Thomas couldn't do it, not until yesterday. Yesterday, he'd walked his fields at dawn like he did every morning, checking soil moisture, looking for signs of disease or pest damage, mentally calculating yields that seemed to shrink with every passing week. The corn that should have been knee-high by now was barely ankle-high, stunted by the delayed planting. The soybeans in the west field were competing with weeds he didn't have time to control properly. And standing there, watching the sun rise over land his great-grandfather had cleared with a mule and a hand plow, Thomas had finally understood something. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Pride wasn't a legacy. Soil was. Crops were. The ability to pass something living and productive to the next generation, that was what mattered. Aunt Margaret hadn't saved for 70 years, so Thomas could watch her gift sit in a bank while everything she wanted to preserve died around him. She had saved so he could fight, so he could adapt, so he could do whatever it took to keep the Grant name on this land. So this morning, Thomas had showered, put on his cleanest jeans and the button-down shirt Sarah had ironed for church, and driven 40 minutes to Premier Agricultural Equipment. He had the checkbook in his pocket, He had done his research. He knew exactly what he needed. A good used tractor, maybe 8 to 10 years old, with enough horsepower for his acreage, but not so new that he'd be paying for features he didn't need. Something in the 40 to 50,000 range, leaving enough inheritance money for repairs, fuel, and a buffer for emergencies. He took a deep breath and walked through the glass doors. The showroom was massive, cathedral ceilings with industrial lighting that made everything gleam. New tractors stood on display like sculptures, their paint jobs perfect, their tires clean and black. The smell of new rubber and hydraulic fluid filled the air, mixed with the faint scent of coffee from a fancy machine in the corner. Everything about the place was designed to intimidate, to make farmers feel small and grateful just to be there. A young man approached immediately, all smiles and energy. He couldn't have been more than 25, with perfectly styled hair, expensive shoes, and a name tag that read, Brandon Miller, Sales Associate. His suit probably cost more than Thomas spent on clothes in a year. "Welcome to Premier," the young man said, his smile wide and practiced. "Looking for something specific today?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Need a tractor, something reliable." "Used is fine. Got about 600 acres, mostly corn and soybeans." Brandon's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes changed. A quick assessment, the kind salesmen make in seconds, calculating commission and worth. 600 acres, he repeated, and you're looking at used. "That's right," Thomas said evenly. "Something in the 40 to 50,000 range." The smile became somehow both brighter and colder. "Well, let's see what we can do." He gestured toward a corner of the showroom where older models were displayed, clearly the less desirable inventory. "Most of our used units are actually out back, but I can show you what we have here first." As they walked, Brandon kept up a steady stream of chatter, but Thomas could hear the shift in tone. The enthusiasm had been replaced by something else, a kind of polite condescension that made his jaw tighten. "So," Brandon said, gesturing to a tractor that had to be at least 20 years old, "this is a classic model, very popular with smaller operations, hobby farms, that sort of thing." "I'm not a hobby farmer," Thomas said quietly. "This is my family's land. Has been for 4 generations. "Oh, sure," Brandon said quickly, but his expression said he didn't believe it, or didn't care. "The thing is, for serious commercial agriculture, you really need something newer, more technology, better fuel efficiency." He gestured toward the gleaming new models at the front of the showroom. "Now those are what the successful farms are running." Thomas felt heat rising in his chest. "I know what successful farms run. I also know what I can afford." Brandon's smile turned pitying. "Look, I get it. Times are tough. A lot of family farms are struggling right now. Have you considered maybe leasing some of your land to a bigger operation? That way you wouldn't have to worry about equipment costs." The suggestion hit Thomas like a slap. Lease his land. Give up farming. Become a landlord on property his ancestors had died protecting. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Getting angry wouldn't help. He needed a tractor, not satisfaction. "Just show me what you have in my price range," he said, forcing his voice to stay level. Brandon sighed, the sound just loud enough to be heard. "Sure, let me get the keys to the back lot." He walked away, and Thomas heard him say something to another salesman near the coffee machine. Both men glanced at Thomas and laughed. Thomas stood there, surrounded by machines that represented everything he needed and couldn't quite reach, and felt the weight of 4 generations pressing down on his shoulders. His great-grandfather had broken this land with his bare hands. His grandfather had survived the Depression without selling a single acre. His father had modernized, adapted, fought through droughts and floods and economic crashes. And now, Thomas, who had promised to carry it forward, was being laughed at by a kid in expensive shoes who probably couldn't tell corn from soybeans in a blind test. The checkbook in his pocket felt heavier. $73,000. Aunt Margaret's life savings, her faith in him, and he was about to hand it to people who saw him as nothing more than a desperate small-timer, barely worth their time. Brandon returned with a set of keys, his smile now completely professional and empty. All right, let's head out back. I've got a couple units that might work. They're nothing special, but they run. As Thomas followed him toward the back door, another salesman called out, "Hey, Brandon, don't forget to upsell him the extended warranty. Even old tractors break down." More laughter. Thomas kept walking, his boots leaving faint traces of dried mud on the pristine showroom floor. Each step felt like a small rebellion, a reminder that he came from soil and work and things these men would never understand. The backlot was exactly what he expected. Rows of used equipment, some clearly well-maintained, others showing signs of hard use and harder years. Brandon walked him past the better machines without slowing, heading toward the far corner where the oldest, most worn tractors sat. "This is more in your range," Brandon said, patting the fender of a tractor that had to be 30 years old, rust visible on the wheel wells, the paint faded to almost nothing. "She's got some miles on her, but the engine's solid." "Probably." Thomas looked at the machine, then at the others in the lot, then back at Brandon. "How much? For this one?" Brandon checked a clipboard. 32,000. It was highway robbery for a tractor in that condition, and they both knew it. Thomas felt something crack inside him, not anger exactly, but something colder, a decision forming. "You got anything better?" Thomas asked. "Better?" Brandon shrugged. "Sure, but you said your budget was 40 to 50. The newer used models start at 75 and go up from there. Way out of range for a small operation like yours?" There it was again. Small operation, as if 600 acres was something to apologize for. As if generations of work and sacrifice meant nothing because he didn't have the newest equipment or the biggest spread. Thomas looked at Brandon for a long moment. The young man shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that something had changed, though he clearly didn't understand what. "Show me your best used tractor," Thomas said quietly. "Don't care about the price. Show me the best you've got." Brandon blinked, confusion crossing his face. "But you said—" "I know what I said. Show me the best." Still uncertain, Brandon led him to a different section of the lot. Here the tractors were newer, cleaner, clearly the premium used inventory. He stopped in front of a massive John Deere 8R series, barely 5 years old, gleaming green paint, enclosed cab with air conditioning, GPS guidance system, the works. "This is top of the line," Brandon said, and Thomas could hear the shift in his voice, the return of salesman enthusiasm now that he smelled a bigger commission. Barely used, traded in by a corporate farm that upgrades every 3 years. Climate-controlled cab, auto steer, integrated crop monitoring. This is what real farmers are running. "How much?" Thomas asked. Brandon checked his clipboard. 195,000. But I could probably get my manager down to 185 if you're serious. Thomas nodded slowly, walking around the machine, running his hand along the pristine paint. He knew tractors. This was the kind of equipment that could transform a farm, make one man as productive as 3, allow precision agriculture that maximized every acre. This was what he should have been running 5 years ago, what he would have been running if he'd made different choices, taken different risks. "I'll take it," Thomas said. Brandon's laugh was automatic, dismissive. "Sir, I appreciate the interest, but this is probably not realistic for your operation." "I said I'll take it," Thomas repeated, pulling the checkbook from his pocket. "Can you write it up for 185, or do I need to talk to your manager?" The color drained from Brandon's face. He stared at the checkbook, then at Thomas, then back at the checkbook. "You're serious. Dead serious." Thomas met his eyes. "Unless there's a reason you don't want the sale." No reason," Brandon stammered. I thought you said 40 to 50,000. "I lied," Thomas said simply. "Wanted to see how you'd treat a farmer who looked like he was struggling. Wanted to see if you'd be decent to someone you thought couldn't afford your best." He paused, letting that sink in. "Guess I got my answer." Brandon's face went red. "Sir, I apologize if I gave you the wrong impression. I was just trying to help you find something in your stated budget." "You laughed at me," Thomas said, his voice quiet but hard as iron. "When you walked away, you laughed. Your friend laughed. You showed me the worst equipment you had and tried to sell it for more than it's worth. Because you thought I was desperate and stupid." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of machinery from the service department. "Now," Thomas continued, "I'm going to buy this tractor. I'm going to write you a check for the full amount right now, and you're going to process this sale, smile, and act like this was your idea all along. Because if you don't, I'm going to walk into your competitor's dealership down the road, buy from them, and tell everyone in 3 counties exactly how Premier Agricultural Equipment treats farmers who don't look rich enough." Brandon swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. Let me get the paperwork started right away." As the young salesman hurried back toward the showroom, Thomas stood alone beside the massive tractor, his heart pounding. He had just committed to spending almost 3 times Aunt Margaret's entire inheritance. He would have to take out a loan for the difference, leverage the farm itself. It was reckless, dangerous, potentially ruinous. But standing there in the dealer's lot, having been dismissed and mocked and shown the worst they had to offer, Thomas had realized something. Aunt Margaret hadn't left him money to play it safe. She'd left him money to fight. And sometimes fighting meant taking risks that terrified you. Sometimes it meant proving to yourself and everyone watching that you refused to be counted out. The sun was high overhead now, glinting off the tractor's green paint. From here, Thomas could almost see his own reflection in the polished metal, distorted but recognizable. A farmer, a landowner, a man who had just made either the best or the worst decision of his life. Inside the showroom, he could see Brandon talking urgently to an older man in a better suit. The manager, probably. Both men kept looking toward Thomas, their expressions shifting from disbelief to excitement as they realized the sale was real. Thomas pulled out his phone and called Sarah. When she answered, he could hear the worry in her voice. "Thomas, everything okay?" "I bought a tractor," he said. "Oh, thank God. Which one did you get?" He paused, looking up at the massive machine beside him. "The expensive one. I'll explain when I get home." There was a long silence. Then Sarah, who had stood beside him through droughts and debts and every disaster farming could throw at them, said simply, "Okay, drive safe." Thomas smiled for the first time all day. As he walked back toward the showroom to finalize the purchase that would either save his farm or destroy it, he thought about Aunt Margaret's letter. The one where she'd written that legacy wasn't about doing things the easy way. It was about doing whatever it took, even when it scared you, even when everyone else thought you were crazy. The mud on his boots had dried now, flaking onto the dealership's pristine floor with every step. He didn't try to avoid it. Let them see where he came from. Let them see what real work looked like. Brandon was waiting with the paperwork, his smile now genuine and eager, all traces of condescension gone. But Thomas barely noticed. He was already thinking about tomorrow, about the fields that needed planting, about the legacy that needed protecting, and about the machine that would help him do both. What he didn't know yet, as he signed the purchase agreement and shook hands with the suddenly respectful manager, was that this decision would ripple far beyond his own farm. That the story of the farmer who'd been laughed at and then bought the most expensive tractor on the lot would spread through the county like wildfire. That it would reach ears he never expected and set in motion events that would reveal secrets about his family's land that had been buried for generations. But that was still to come. For now, there was just the satisfaction of proving them wrong and the terrifying excitement of a risk that couldn't be undone. The new tractor arrived on a flatbed trailer 3 days later, and by then, the whole county knew what Thomas Grant had done. The story had mutated with each retelling, growing more elaborate, more improbable. Some said he'd walked in wearing his work boots caked in manure just to make a point. Others claimed he'd written the check with dirt still under his fingernails, that the salesman had actually cried. A few swore Thomas had paid in cash, pulled it straight from a duffel bag like some kind of farmer outlaw. Thomas let them talk. He had more pressing concerns than gossip, like the fact that he'd just committed to a loan payment of $3,200 a month for 5 years, on top of everything else the farm demanded. Like the fact that his daughter Emily had stopped speaking to him after learning what he'd done, locking herself in her childhood bedroom whenever he came near. Like the fact that Sarah had smiled and said it would be fine. but her eyes carried a worry that kept him awake at night. The morning after the tractor's delivery, Thomas was in the barn at dawn, running his hands over the machine's controls, trying to familiarize himself with technology that seemed designed for someone younger, someone who'd grown up with computers instead of carburetors. The GPS screen glowed in the dim light, displaying his fields in perfect digital detail, every boundary line precise, every acre accounted for. It felt like looking at his land through someone else's eyes, reduced to coordinates and yield projections. He didn't hear Robert approach until his friend was standing right beside him. "You've lost your mind," Robert said without preamble. He was 54, 2 years older than Thomas, with the same weathered face and work-worn hands that came from a lifetime of farming. They'd grown up together, their properties sharing a fence line, their families intertwined through generations of mutual help and occasional feuds. Robert knew Thomas better than anyone except Sarah, which made the disappointment in his voice cut deeper. "Morning to you too," Thomas said, not looking up from the tractor's control panel. "Don't morning me." Robert climbed up onto the machine's step, forcing Thomas to acknowledge him. $185,000. Have you actually calculated what that means? What happens if we get another drought? What happens if prices drop? You'll lose everything. "I'm losing everything anyway," Thomas replied. "The old Ferguson was dead. I had half my fields unplanted. What was I supposed to do? Buy a reasonable tractor like a reasonable person?" Robert's voice rose. There were a dozen machines in that lot that would have done the job for half the price. "This," he gestured at the gleaming John Deere, "this is ego. This is you proving something to a kid who doesn't matter, and it's going to cost you the farm." Thomas finally met his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Robert's face flushed. "I've been watching you for a year now, ever since your dad died. Watching you try to be him, try to live up to some impossible standard he set. But your dad would never have made a decision this stupid. He was practical. He was careful." "My dad also left me a farm that was barely breaking even," Thomas shot back. "Outdated equipment, soil that needed work, debt he'd been hiding for years. You want to know why I bought this tractor? Because I'm tired of barely surviving, tired of apologizing for trying to actually succeed instead of just hanging on by my fingernails." The words hung between them, sharp and true. Robert stepped back, his expression shifting from anger to something more complicated. "Your dad did the best he could," he said quietly. "I know." Thomas's voice softened. "But his best isn't going to be enough anymore. The margins are too thin. The competition's too fierce. Either I modernize or I sell, and I'm not selling." Before Robert could respond, Sarah's voice called from the house. "Thomas? Phone?" He climbed down from the tractor, grateful for the interruption. The conversation with Robert had opened wounds he didn't have time to address, questions about his father's legacy that had been festering since the funeral. The phone call was from the bank. Thomas listened, his stomach sinking with each word, then hung up without saying goodbye. Sarah was watching from the kitchen doorway. "What is it?" "The loan." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "They want collateral. The tractor isn't enough. They want a lien on the entire farm." Sarah's face went pale. "The whole farm?" "Thomas, if something goes wrong—" "I know." He couldn't look at her. "But I don't have a choice. It's either this or we don't plant at all." "There's always a choice." Emily's voice cut in from the hallway. She stood there in her college sweatshirt, her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn jaw. "You could swallow your pride. You could admit this was a mistake." "It's not a mistake," Thomas said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Really?" Emily stepped into the kitchen. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you spent my college fund on a tractor to impress some stranger who made you feel small." The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow. "That's not, isn't it?" Emily's voice broke. "Grandpa's inheritance was supposed to help me finish school. That was the plan. But you couldn't stand being laughed at, so now I'm looking at student loans while you've got the fanciest tractor in 3 counties. Sarah moved between them. "Emily, that's not fair. Your father's trying to save the farm by risking it all." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "By betting everything on his ego. What happens when this doesn't work, Mom? What happens when we lose the house, the land, everything? Grandpa built. Thomas opened his mouth but found no words. Because Emily was right, at least partially. He had let pride drive the decision. But it wasn't just pride. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. A need to prove that 4 generations hadn't led to failure. That he was more than a caretaker watching something slowly die. Emily left without waiting for an answer, her footsteps heavy on the stairs. Sarah touched Thomas's arm, a gesture meant to comfort, but her hand was trembling. "Tell me I didn't just destroy everything," he said quietly. "You did what you thought was right." Sarah's voice was steady but tired. "Now we just have to make it work." That afternoon, Thomas was in the fields, finally using the new tractor to finish the delayed planting, when he noticed a truck parked on the dirt road that bordered his property. Not just any truck. A silver Mercedes pickup that cost more than some houses, chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Marcus Hendricks leaned against it, watching Thomas work. Thomas killed the engine and climbed down. Hendricks was everything Thomas wasn't. 3rd-generation wealth, a corporate farming operation that spanned 12,000 acres across 2 states, a man who treated agriculture like a stock portfolio rather than a way of life. They'd never spoken directly, though Thomas had seen him at county meetings, always surrounded by lawyers and accountants. "Heard you made quite a purchase," Hendricks called out as Thomas approached. His voice was smooth, educated, carrying none of the rural accent that marked most farmers in the area. "That's a beautiful machine. 8 series, right? Top of the line." "What do you want, Hendricks?" Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Direct." "I like that. I'll be equally direct. I want to buy your farm." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Not interested." "Hear me out." Hendricks pulled a folder from his truck. "I'm prepared to offer you $2.3 million for the property. That's well above market value, more than enough to pay off whatever debts you're carrying, set you and your family up comfortably. You could retire, let your daughter finish school without worrying about money." "The farm's not for sale," Thomas repeated. "Everything's for sale at the right price." Hendricks opened the folder, showing neat rows of numbers, projections, offers spelled out in legal precision. "Look at this realistically, Grant. You just leveraged your entire operation to buy a tractor you can barely afford. 1 bad season and you're finished. Why not walk away now with your dignity intact? Because it's my land." Thomas's voice was hard. "My father's land. My grandfather's land. Land doesn't care whose name is on the deed." Hendricks's tone shifted, becoming almost philosophical. "It just sits there, season after season, waiting for whoever can make it produce. Your family's had a good run, but the era of small family farms is over. You know it. Everyone knows it. The only question is whether you're going to accept it gracefully or whether you're going to fight until you have nothing left." Thomas looked past Hendricks at his fields, at the rows of corn just beginning to emerge from the soil. From here, he could see the fence line his grandfather had built, the old oak tree where his father had proposed to his mother, the creek where he'd taught Emily to fish. Every acre held memories, stories written in soil and sweat and sacrifice. "Get off my property," he said quietly. Hendricks closed the folder with a sigh. "I'm trying to help you, Grant. In 6 months, maybe a year, you're going to be facing foreclosure. The bank will sell to whoever bids highest, and that'll be me anyway. Only then you'll walk away with nothing. Or maybe I'll prove you wrong. Maybe." Hendricks climbed back into his truck, but I doubt it. He started the engine, then leaned out the window. "When you're ready to be realistic, my offer stands. For now." As the Mercedes drove away, Thomas stood in the road, hands clenched, rage and fear warring in his chest. Hendricks was right about the economics, about the brutal mathematics that made small farms nearly impossible to sustain. But he was wrong about everything that mattered, about legacy, about belonging, about the things that couldn't be reduced to profit margins and efficiency ratios. That evening, Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the farm's financial records spread out before him. The numbers didn't lie. Even with good yields, even with decent prices, the margins were razor thin. The new loan payment would consume most of his operating budget. One significant unexpected expense, a broken irrigation system, a medical emergency, anything, and the whole structure would collapse. Sarah brought him coffee and sat down across from him. She didn't say anything, just sat there being present, a skill she'd perfected over 30 years of marriage to a man who processed problems in silence. "Hendricks came by today," Thomas said finally. "I figured." Sarah sipped her own coffee. "What did he want?" "To buy the farm. $2.3 million. Sarah's eyes widened. "That's a lot of money." "It is." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Sarah asked, "What did you tell him?" "To leave." She nodded slowly. "Good." "Just good?" Thomas looked at her. "You don't want to talk about it? Think it through?" "What's to think through?" Sarah met his eyes. "This is your family's land. Emily's land. Maybe someday our grandchildren's land. You can't put a price on that." Hendricks said, "I was letting pride destroy us." "Pride?" Sarah's voice turned fierce. "Thomas Grant, you are many things, but proud isn't one of them. A proud man wouldn't have spent 20 years working 18-hour days to keep this place running. A proud man wouldn't have swallowed his ego and taken your aunt's inheritance. You bought that tractor because you refused to give up, and there's nothing wrong with that." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he'd been carrying since the moment he'd signed the loan papers. Even if it all goes wrong, even then, we'll figure it out. We always do. The sound of gravel crunching made them both turn. Through the window, Thomas saw headlights coming up the drive. At this hour, it could only mean trouble. The truck that pulled up wasn't one he recognized. An older Ford, well-maintained but showing its years. The man who stepped out was in his 70s, tall and lean, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had started to betray them, but whose will remained iron strong. Thomas opened the door before the man could knock. "Help you?" The old man studied him with eyes that were startlingly blue, intense and measuring. "You're Thomas Grant." Statement, not question. "That's right. I'm Henry Morrison. Your grandfather and I were friends." The old man's voice was gravelly, worn by years and probably cigarettes. "Heard about your tractor purchase. Heard Marcus Hendricks paid you a visit. Figured it was time we talked." Thomas glanced at Sarah, who shrugged. He stepped aside, letting Morrison enter. They sat in the living room, Morrison in the old recliner that had been Thomas's father's favorite chair. The old man looked around, taking in the photographs on the walls, the worn furniture, the accumulated evidence of generations lived in this house. "Your grandfather never told you about the water, did he?" Morrison said without preamble. Thomas frowned. "What water?" "There's an aquifer under your property." Morrison leaned forward. "Not a big one, but deep, pure, and right now, extremely valuable. Your land sits right on top of it, has been for millions of years, will be for millions more. But the access point, the best place to tap it, that's on your eastern 40 acres. Thomas felt his confusion deepen. "I don't understand. We've got wells. We've always had water." "Not like this," Morrison's voice dropped. "This is drinking water quality, spring water, the kind companies pay fortunes to bottle and sell. About 15 years ago, a surveying company came through. They were quiet about it, didn't advertise what they found. But they mapped that aquifer down to the last detail. And your grandfather found out." "How do you know this?" "Because he asked me what to do about it." Morrison's eyes grew distant. He knew once word got out, every corporation in the country would come sniffing around, offering money, making threats, doing whatever it took to get access. So he buried the survey results, never told anyone, not even your father. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Hendricks knows." Morrison's voice turned grim. "That surveying company. They kept copies. And Hendricks got his hands on them about a month ago. His offer to buy your farm has nothing to do with farming. He wants the water rights." Thomas felt the room tilt. $2.3 million suddenly made horrible sense. Not a generous offer, but a calculated investment. Access to an aquifer that could generate revenue for decades. The tractor, Morrison continued. "That was smart. even if you didn't know it. You need to make this farm successful enough that selling isn't your only option. Because once Hendricks gets this land, that water becomes his, and every farmer in this county who depends on wells will be at his mercy. Thomas stood, moving to the window, looking out at his fields. Everything was connected. His father's struggles, the thin margins, Hendricks's sudden interest, even the dealership salesman's contempt, the assumption that small farmers were dinosaurs waiting for extinction. "What do I do?" he asked. Morrison rose slowly. "You fight. You plant your crops. You make your payments. You prove that family farms can still survive, still matter. And you never, ever let them take this land." After Morrison left, Thomas and Sarah sat in silence. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, transforming everything they thought they understood about their situation. "We're not just fighting for the farm anymore," Sarah said finally. "We're fighting for the whole community." Thomas nodded. The responsibility felt crushing. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Purpose. The kind his father had carried, that his grandfather had embodied. They hadn't just been farmers, they'd been guardians of something larger than themselves. In the morning, Thomas would return to the fields. He would finish planting. He would learn the new tractor systems, push himself and the land to produce yields that would make the payments possible. He would prove that Hendricks was wrong, that the age of family farms wasn't over, that some things still mattered more than profit margins and corporate efficiency. But tonight, sitting with Sarah in the quiet house, Thomas allowed himself to feel the enormity of what he'd stumbled into. A hidden aquifer, corporate predators, a legacy that extended far beyond his family to everyone who drew water from this land. Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. "I heard," she said quietly. "Mr. Morrison talks loud." Thomas opened his arms and his daughter came to him, let herself be held like she hadn't since she was small. "I'm sorry," he said, "for risking everything, for scaring you. Don't apologize." Emily pulled back, and Thomas saw something new in her face. Determination. Understanding. "If Grandpa kept this secret to protect people, then finishing what he started matters more than my tuition." Sarah wrapped her arms around them both, and for a moment, the three of them stood there, a family bound by more than blood, bound by land and water and the stubborn refusal to let corporations and money erase everything that made life worth living. Outside, the fields stretched into darkness, waiting for the work that would either save them or prove their doom. And beneath it all, an aquifer flowed eternal, keeping secrets that were no longer hidden, demanding choices that couldn't be unmade. The spring rains came late that year, and by June the soil had turned to dust. Thomas watched the weather forecasts with a knot in his stomach that never loosened, checking radar maps that showed storms breaking apart before they reached his county, dissipating into nothing over land that desperately needed water. The corn that should have been waist-high stood stunted and pale, leaves curling at the edges. The soybeans looked better, more drought-resistant by nature, but their yield projections dropped with every rainless week. The new tractor sat in the barn most nights, its GPS system displaying data that confirmed what Thomas already knew from walking the fields. Soil moisture levels critical, projected yields down 30%. Revenue estimates that wouldn't cover the loan payments wouldn't come close. He ran the irrigation systems as much as he could afford, pumping from the wells that tapped into the very aquifer Hendricks wanted to control. The irony wasn't lost on him. The water that might save this season was the same water that made his land valuable enough to steal. Every gallon he pulled from the ground felt like both salvation and a countdown to something inevitable. Sarah started keeping a journal of expenses, tracking every dollar with a precision that spoke of fear more than organization. Emily came home weekends from college, not to study but to help, driving the old pickup between fields with water containers, checking irrigation lines, doing whatever freed Thomas to focus on the endless work. She never mentioned tuition or student loans, but Thomas saw the financial aid papers on her desk, the part-time job applications, the careful calculations of a future being reshaped by his choices. Robert stopped coming by. The fence line between their properties became a border neither crossed, a silence that hurt worse than any argument. Thomas would see him sometimes in the distance, working his own fields with equipment that was old but paid for, following a strategy of caution that suddenly seemed wiser than Thomas wanted to admit. By mid-July, the bank called twice a week. Friendly at first, then less so. The loan officer, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd gone to school with Emily, spoke in the careful tones of someone delivering bad news to people she actually cared about. "Thomas, we need to talk about next month's payment," she said during one call, her voice tight with professional sympathy. "Given the drought conditions and your projected yields, we're concerned about your ability to meet the obligation." "I'll make the payment," Thomas said, standing in his kitchen, looking out at fields that shimmered with heat waves. "With what revenue?" Patricia's question was gentle but unanswerable. "Your crop insurance will cover some losses, but not enough. Not with the debt load you're carrying. I'll figure it out. The bank isn't your enemy here. We want you to succeed. But we have responsibilities too. If you can't make the August payment, we'll need to discuss alternatives." Alternatives meant foreclosure, meant Hendricks, meant the end of everything. Thomas hung up and walked out to the barn, to the tractor that represented both his pride and his potential ruin. The machine gleamed even in the dim light, technology and power and the promise of productivity. But promises meant nothing in a drought. The most advanced tractor in the world couldn't make rainfall. He didn't hear Emily approach until she was standing beside him. "There's something I need to show you," she said. She led him not to the fields, but to the old grain silo that hadn't been used in years, the one his grandfather had built in the 1960s and his father had eventually abandoned in favor of more modern storage. The heavy door stuck, rust-frozen, but together they forced it open. Inside, Emily turned on a flashlight, illuminating the curved metal walls. At the back of the silo, barely visible, was a steel cabinet built into the wall itself, painted the same color as the silo to blend in seamlessly. "I found this when I was 12, Emily said. "Never told anyone because Grandpa made me promise not to. Said there were things here that needed to stay hidden until the right time." She opened the cabinet. Inside were three things: a leather-bound ledger, a metal box, and an envelope with Thomas's name written in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Thomas took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for important documents. Inside was a letter dated 2 weeks before his grandfather's death. "Thomas, if you're reading this, then the farm is in trouble and you've found the courage to keep fighting instead of selling. Good. That means I taught you something worth knowing. The aquifer under our land isn't just valuable for drinking water. 20 years ago, I had the soil tested by a geologist I trusted. The minerals in that water, combined with our particular soil composition, create growing conditions that can't be replicated. Crops grown here, irrigated with that water, produce yields and quality levels that are measurably superior. The ledger contains years of data proving it. Corporate farms know about efficiency and scale, but they don't know about this. They don't know that our land isn't just valuable for what's under it, but for what it can produce because of what's under it. The metal box contains something else: seeds. Heritage varieties I've been developing for 30 years, specifically adapted to our soil and water. They won't work on just any land. But here, with our aquifer, they'll outperform anything corporate operations can produce. I never told your father about this because he would have felt obligated to exploit it, to turn it into profit. But profit was never the point. The point was sustainability, resilience, the ability to outlast the corporations that want to swallow us whole. Use this wisely, not to get rich, but to survive, to prove that knowledge and land and legacy matter more than size and capital. The farm isn't just dirt and water, it's possibility itself, if you're willing to see it. Love always. Grandpa Thomas read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. Emily watched him, her expression unreadable. The ledger, she said quietly, has data from 30 growing seasons. Yield comparisons, quality analyses. Grandpa was running experiments the whole time, documenting everything. These seeds, grown with our water on our soil, they produce 20 to 30% higher yields than conventional varieties. And the quality, the nutritional content, it's measurably better. Why didn't you tell me? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because you needed to decide on your own that the farm was worth fighting for. Emily's eyes met his. If I'd shown you this right away, you might have seen it as just another resource to exploit, another way to make money. But Grandpa didn't want that. He wanted someone who'd fight for the land itself, not just what it could produce. Thomas looked at the metal box, at the seeds his grandfather had spent decades developing. Heritage corn varieties, drought-resistant soybeans, specialty grains. Each one adapted specifically to this land, this water, this particular confluence of geology and biology that couldn't be replicated anywhere else. It was too late for this season's corn and soybeans. Those were already in the ground, already struggling. But the specialty grains, some of them could still be planted, could produce a late-season harvest that might change everything. The next morning, Thomas was in the fields before dawn, the new tractor's lights cutting through the darkness. He had 40 acres in the southwest section that he'd left fallow, uncertain what to plant. Now he had an answer. The planting took 3 days, working from dawn until the tractor's lights were the only illumination in the darkness. Sarah brought meals to the field. Emily ran the irrigation systems, using their precious aquifer water with a new understanding of its value. Even Robert appeared on the third day, crossing the fence line without explanation, bringing his own equipment to help with the final acres. They didn't talk about the months of silence. They just worked, side by side, the way their fathers had, the way their grandfathers had before them. By the time the last seed was in the ground, Thomas's body ached with exhaustion, but his mind was clearer than it had been in months. The specialty grains sprouted within a week, growing with a vigor that seemed almost unnatural. Thomas checked them obsessively, measuring growth rates, comparing them to his grandfather's ledger. The numbers matched. The heritage varieties, fed by the aquifer water, thrived even as the conventional crops struggled. Word spread. Other farmers started asking questions, appearing at the fence line to look at the unusual plants, their distinctive appearance marking them as something different. Thomas shared what he knew, offered seeds to neighbors, explained about the aquifer and the soil and the decades of careful development his grandfather had done. Marcus Hendricks heard the talk too. He showed up on a Wednesday afternoon, his Mercedes truck looking absurd, parked next to Thomas's dusty farm vehicles. "You found the seeds," Hendricks said, walking through the specialty grain field. His voice was level, but Thomas heard something underneath. Resignation, maybe, or respect. "My grandfather's life work," Thomas replied. Hendricks nodded slowly, running his hand over the grain stalks. "I knew he was developing something. The surveying company's reports mentioned anomalous crop data. I thought it was just superior water. Didn't realize he'd been breeding plants to match the terroir, like a vintner with grapes." "This land isn't for sale," Thomas said. "Not now, not ever." "I know." Hendricks pulled an envelope from his pocket. "This is a contract. Not to buy your land, to buy your grain. Specialty crops, heritage varieties, premium pricing. I'm expanding into organic and specialty markets. I need suppliers I can trust, farmers who know their land well enough to produce consistent quality." Thomas took the envelope but didn't open it. "Why?" "Because you were right and I was wrong." Hendricks met his eyes. "The future of farming isn't just about scale. It's about knowledge. About matching specific crops to specific land. Your grandfather understood that. You're starting to understand it. I'd rather work with you than against you." The contract offered prices 40% above conventional rates, with a 3-year commitment and options to extend. It was enough to make the loan payments, enough to keep the farm viable, enough to prove that small operations could still compete through quality and specialization instead of just volume. But it was also a kind of surrender, accepting help from the man who'd wanted to consume him. Thomas stood in the field, the contract in his hands, pride and pragmatism warring in his chest. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "You're not proud, Thomas. You're stubborn. There's a difference." "I'll need to review this with my family," Thomas said finally. "Of course." Hendricks turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, That tractor purchase was the smartest thing you could have done. Showed everyone you weren't backing down. Made me reconsider my assumptions about small farmers. Sometimes the most important investments are the ones that prove who you are. That evening, Thomas, Sarah, and Emily sat at the kitchen table, the contract spread out before them. They read it together, discussed the implications, weighed the risks against the opportunities. "It's not what Grandpa wanted," Emily said. "He didn't develop those seeds to sell to corporations." "He didn't develop them to let the farm die either," Sarah countered gently. "He wanted sustainability. This gives us that." Thomas said nothing for a long moment, thinking about his grandfather's letter, about legacy and pride and the difference between surrender and adaptation. "We sign," he said finally, "but with conditions. The seeds stay ours. We control what gets planted and how, and we share the heritage varieties with other small farmers who want to try them. This doesn't become an exclusive arrangement that shuts everyone else out." Emily smiled, something like pride in her eyes. Grandpa would like that. The contract was signed the next day, with amendments that protected the seed's availability and required profit sharing with a cooperative of local farmers. Hendricks agreed without argument, perhaps understanding that the real value wasn't in exclusivity, but in the development of a regional specialty market that could benefit everyone. August came with the first real rain in months, too late for the conventional crops, but perfect timing for the specialty grains. They grew tall and full, their stalks thick with seeds that glowed golden in the afternoon light. Thomas walked the fields each evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with Sarah or Emily or Robert, who'd quietly resumed their friendship without ever discussing the breach. The first harvest came in September, yields that exceeded even his grandfather's projections. The grain had a distinctive quality, a depth of flavor and nutritional content that testing confirmed was unique to this land, this water, this particular alchemy of geology and biology and careful cultivation. The loan payment came due in October. Thomas made it with room to spare, the specialty crop revenues more than covering the obligation. Patricia Chen called to congratulate him, her voice warm with genuine happiness. By December, the farm had shifted entirely. Half the acreage was now devoted to specialty crops, heritage varieties that commanded premium prices. The other half rotated between conventional crops and soil restoration programs, following practices his grandfather had documented but never fully implemented. The new tractor, once a symbol of reckless pride, had become the tool that made precision agriculture possible, allowing Thomas to manage the complex crop rotations and specialized growing requirements that made the operation successful. Emily transferred to the State Agricultural College, switching her major to sustainable agriculture and genetic preservation. She talked about coming back after graduation, about continuing her great-grandfather's work, developing crop varieties adapted to specific land characteristics. The conversation no longer carried the weight of obligation, but of genuine interest, of seeing possibility instead of burden. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered in the living room, the same space where Morrison had revealed the aquifer's existence, where Thomas had felt the crushing weight of responsibility that came with hidden knowledge. Now the room felt different, lighter somehow, though the furniture was the same, and the photographs on the walls hadn't changed. Robert was there with his family, the silence between the two farms finally broken. Morrison came too, old and frail but sharp-eyed as ever, nodding approval at the changes he'd catalyzed simply by telling the truth at the right moment. "Your grandfather would be proud," Morrison said to Thomas, his gravelly voice softened by age and whiskey. "Not because you succeeded, but because you understood what success actually means, not maximum profit, not corporate efficiency, but sustainability, community, knowledge passed down and built upon." "I almost lost it all," Thomas admitted. "The pride that made me buy that tractor, it almost destroyed everything." Morrison shook his head. "Wasn't pride. Was refusal to accept a future you didn't want? There's a difference. Pride is thinking you know everything. What you did was insist that your knowledge, your grandfather's knowledge, mattered as much as their capital. And you were right." Later, after the guests had left and Emily had gone to bed, Thomas and Sarah stood on the porch, looking out at fields covered in snow, resting now but full of potential for the spring. The tractor sat in the barn, paid for through revenue it had helped generate. The land stretched out before them, 4 generations of work and sacrifice, and stubborn refusal to surrender. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "The risk? The fear? Everything we went through?" Thomas thought about the question, really thought about it. The terror of the loan, the drought, the sleepless nights and the phone calls from the bank. Emily's tears and Robert's silence. The moment in the dealership when pride and desperation had fused into a decision that changed everything. "No," he said finally, "because it taught me something Grandpa tried to tell me but I couldn't hear. The land isn't something you own. It's something you belong to. And sometimes belonging means fighting for it, even when fighting seems crazy." He thought about his father, about the struggles he'd hidden, the debt he'd carried silently, about the choice not to exploit the aquifer or the heritage seeds, leaving them instead for a future he'd never see. About the weight of legacy and the strange grace of discovering that your predecessors had already given you everything you needed, if you were willing to look. The snow fell softly, covering everything in white, erasing boundaries and divisions, making the 600 acres look limitless in the moonlight. Somewhere beneath it all, the aquifer flowed eternal, patient, waiting for spring when its water would rise again through the soil, bringing life to seeds that had been developed over decades to thrive in this exact place, this specific confluence of earth and water and human knowledge. Thomas had spent his last $900 on a farm that was failing, then risked everything he had on a tractor he couldn't afford, driven by a moment of wounded pride in a dealership parking lot. But somewhere in that reckless choice, in that refusal to accept dismissal and diminishment, he'd found something his. Grandfather had known all along. Some things are worth more than their price. Some fights are worth having even when the odds are terrible. And sometimes the most important legacy isn't land or money or even knowledge, but the simple stubborn insistence that small things can matter, that individuals can resist being erased, that family and place and memory have value that can't be calculated on any corporate spreadsheet. The tractor had saved the farm. But more than that, it had saved Thomas himself, pulling him from the slow death of just hanging on into the fierce, terrifying, exhilarating life of actually fighting for something that mattered. As he stood there with Sarah, looking out at land, his great-grandfather had cleared, and his grandfather had studied, and his father had loved. Thomas finally understood what it meant to be a steward of legacy. Not to preserve it unchanged, frozen in amber like some museum piece, but to honor it by building upon it, by taking what came before and making it stronger, more resilient, more capable of surviving whatever came next. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to the winter night. Thomas listened to the sound, as familiar as his own heartbeat, as eternal as the aquifer flowing beneath his feet. This was home. This was legacy. This was the life his grandfather had protected and his father had struggled for, and he had nearly lost, but somehow, against all odds and every reasonable expectation, had managed to save. Not by playing it safe, not by accepting what others told him was possible, but by believing, in one moment of desperate pride and absolute conviction, that he was worth more than their laughter suggested, that his land was worth more than any corporate offer, that legacy mattered more than efficiency, and family more than profit, and stubbornness more than surrender. The farm would face other challenges, other droughts, other price drops, other moments when everything seemed impossible. But Thomas knew now that he wouldn't face them alone. He had Sarah's steady strength and Emily's sharp intelligence and Robert's quiet friendship. He had his grandfather's seeds and his father's land, and the knowledge that 4 generations had built, brick by brick, season by season. And he had the tractor, gleaming in the barn, a monument to the moment when pride and desperation had fused into something larger than either. A reminder that sometimes the craziest decisions are the most necessary ones, and sometimes refusing to accept defeat is the only sane response to a world that wants to erase you. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow and earth and the promise of spring still months away. Thomas breathed it in, this air that smelled like home, like memory, like everything worth fighting for. And standing there on the porch his grandfather had built, looking out at fields his great-grandfather had cleared, he allowed himself something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Peace. Spring returned to the Grant farm with a violence of color that seemed almost defiant. The winter had been long, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you wonder if warmth will ever return. But when it broke completely. The fields exploded with green, the heritage grains pushing through soil that had been enriched by a winter's worth of careful planning and soil amendments based on formulas Thomas had found in his grandfather's ledger. It had been 14 months since Thomas walked into that dealership with $900 and a checkbook that would change everything. 14 months since Brandon Miller had laughed at a farmer in muddy boots. The story had taken on a life of its own in the county, growing with each retelling until it became something larger than the facts, a parable about pride and persistence that people told at diners and grain elevators and church socials. But Thomas barely thought about the dealership anymore. The tractor was simply a tool now, no longer a symbol of anything except the work that needed doing. He'd learned its systems so thoroughly that operating it felt like second nature. The GPS guidance and yield monitoring, just extensions of knowledge he'd been building his whole life. The machine had become what it was always meant to be, not a statement, but a means to an end. The specialty crops had transformed everything, just as his grandfather had predicted. The heritage corn varieties produced kernels with a sweetness and depth of flavor that artisanal food producers paid premium prices for. The ancient wheat strains, dormant for decades before his grandfather had preserved them, yielded flour that bakers in 3 states now requested by name. Even the soybeans, modified over 30 years to thrive in the specific mineral composition of the aquifer water, commanded prices that made conventional farming look almost quaint. But the real change wasn't in the crops or the revenue. It was in how Thomas understood his role. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a steward of knowledge, a keeper of genetic diversity, part of a chain of preservation that stretched back generations and would, if he did his job right, extend forward just as far. Emily had come home for good in March, her degree finished early through accelerated coursework and a thesis on heritage crop preservation that had earned her recognition from agricultural organizations across the country. She didn't announce she was staying. She just started working the fields alongside Thomas, asking questions about the planting schedules and soil composition and cross-pollination protocols with an intensity that reminded him painfully of his grandfather. One morning in late April, Thomas found her in the old grain silo that had become their seed library, carefully labeling mason jars filled with varieties his grandfather had preserved. Each jar had a story, notes in his grandfather's handwriting about where the seeds had come from, how they had been adapted, what combinations had failed and which had succeeded. This one, Emily said, holding up a jar of what looked like ordinary corn kernels, took Grandpa 12 years to develop. Started with a Cherokee heirloom variety, crossed it with a drought-resistant hybrid, then spent a decade selecting for the traits he wanted. The notes say it'll grow in soil that would kill conventional corn. Thomas took the jar, feeling the weight of it, the accumulated years of patient work reduced to a handful of seeds. Your great-grandfather would have loved seeing you do this. Emily smiled, but there was sadness in it too. I wish I'd known him better. Really known him, not just the old man who gave me candy and let me drive the tractor on his lap. He knew you, Thomas said. That letter he left, it wasn't addressed to me specifically. It was addressed to whoever cared enough to keep looking, to keep fighting. He knew it might be you, might be your kids someday. The point was the caring, not the name. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, organizing seeds, updating records, preparing for the spring planting that would expand the heritage crop program even further. Through the silo's open door, Thomas could see Robert working his own fields, the fence line between their properties no longer a boundary, but just a line on a map, crossed freely now by both families. The rift had healed slowly, without any grand reconciliation or apology. Robert had simply started showing up again, offering help without being asked, sharing equipment and labor the way their fathers had. One evening over beer on Thomas's porch, Robert had said only this: "Watching you almost lose everything and refuse to quit, that changed something for me. Made me realize I'd been playing it too safe, holding on so tight I was strangling what I was trying to protect." They hadn't needed more words than that. The shared language of farming, of knowing what it meant to gamble everything on weather and prices, and the countless variables beyond any farmer's control, that was communication enough. The cooperative Thomas had helped establish was thriving. 23 small farms now, all growing heritage varieties, sharing knowledge and resources and market access. Hendricks had been true to his word, purchasing their specialty crops at premium prices and connecting them with markets that valued quality and story over simple volume. The relationship remained cautious, professional, but it worked. What surprised Thomas most was how the land itself seemed to respond to the change. It was probably imagination, probably just the result of better soil management and crop rotation practices pulled from his grandfather's research. But walking the fields now felt different. The soil had a richness to it, a vitality that had been missing during those desperate years when every acre had been pushed to maximum production regardless of what it needed. Sarah had started keeping bees, dozens of hives scattered across the property, pollinating the heritage crops and producing honey that tasted distinctly of the flowers that grew from their particular soil. She sold it at farmers markets with labels that read, "Grant Farm Honey, 4 generations of careful keeping," and people drove from hours away to buy it, drawn by some hunger for connection to land and legacy that supermarket products couldn't satisfy. On a warm evening in May, the family gathered for dinner on the porch, something they'd started doing regularly now that the desperate urgency of survival had eased into something more sustainable. Emily had cooked, using vegetables from Sarah's garden and pork from a neighbor who raised heritage breed pigs. The food tasted like the land itself, rich and complex and impossible to replicate anywhere else. "I've been thinking," Emily said, setting down her fork, "about expanding the seed library, making it available to other farmers, maybe starting a regional preservation network. There are varieties being lost every year, knowledge dying with people who never wrote it down." Thomas nodded slowly. "Your great-grandfather would say the seeds are the easy part. The hard part is preserving the knowledge of how to use them, how to read the land and the weather and know what each variety needs. So we teach people," Emily said simply. "We document everything, create guides, maybe even start workshops. This farm could become a learning center, a place where the old knowledge gets preserved and passed on." Sarah smiled. "Your grandfather had a name for that. He called it land memory. The idea that soil remembers what's been grown in it, how it's been treated, and that farmers need to learn to read that memory." The conversation drifted to logistics, planning, the practical details of turning vision into reality. But beneath it ran a current of something else: purpose, the understanding that they weren't just farming anymore. They were engaged in preservation, in resistance against the industrial erasure of diversity and knowledge and the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd learned to work with land rather than simply extracting from it. As the sun set, painting the fields in shades of gold and amber, Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them here, the bankruptcy of his investment career, the desperate purchase of the farm, his father's death, and the inheritance from Aunt Margaret. The moment of wounded pride in the dealership that had led to a decision that should have destroyed everything. But it hadn't destroyed anything. Somehow, through a combination of luck and stubbornness and the hidden gifts his grandfather had left behind, it had saved everything. Not just the farm, but something larger, a way of life, a relationship with land, the possibility that small could still matter in a world designed for scale. Morrison died that June, quietly in his sleep at 87. At the funeral, Thomas learned things he'd never known about the old man, that he'd been a professor of soil science before retiring to farm, that he'd helped Thomas's grandfather develop some of the heritage varieties, providing technical knowledge to complement practical experience, that he'd spent his last years documenting oral histories of old farmers, preserving stories and techniques that would otherwise die with their tellers. In his will, Morrison left his entire collection of research and interviews to Emily, along with a note that said simply, "Continue the work. The land remembers, but only if we teach it what to remember." Emily spent the summer organizing Morrison's papers, digitizing the old cassette tapes and reel-to-reel recordings, creating an archive of farming knowledge from an era before industrial agriculture had standardized everything. She found interviews with Thomas's grandfather, his voice younger than Thomas had ever heard it, talking about plant breeding and soil composition with a passion that made the decades fall away. Listening to those tapes, sitting in the silo surrounded by the seeds his grandfather had preserved, Thomas felt the full weight of legacy, not as burden, but as gift. All these people, his grandfather and Morrison and countless others, had done this work not for profit or recognition, but because they believed it mattered, because they understood that diversity in knowledge and the patient accumulation of wisdom were worth preserving even when the market said otherwise. The harvests that fall exceeded every projection. The fields yielded abundantly, the heritage varieties producing exactly as his grandfather's notes had predicted. The financial pressure that had kept Thomas awake at night for over a year finally eased. The loan payments were manageable now. The farm was profitable, not extravagantly but sustainably, generating enough to live on and invest in improvements and slowly build the kind of buffer that allowed for experimentation and risk. On the anniversary of that morning in the dealership, Thomas drove past Premier Agricultural Equipment. The building looked the same, the showroom still full of gleaming machines, but the sign in the window advertising positions available suggested turnover in the sales department. He wondered briefly if Brandon Miller still worked there, if he ever thought about the farmer he'd dismissed and what had come after. But it didn't matter. The dealership had been a catalyst, nothing more. The real story was in the soil, in the seeds, in the patient work of understanding land well enough to coax from it not maximum production, but sustainable abundance. Emily had taken over most of the day-to-day farming operations by then, freeing Thomas to focus on the preservation work and the cooperative. He spent his days now consulting with other farmers, sharing his grandfather's research, helping them transition to heritage varieties and sustainable practices. It was different work than farming, more teaching than doing, but it felt right, like completing a circle his grandfather had started. Sarah's bees thrived, their honey production increasing each year as the diversity of flowering plants on the farm expanded. She'd started teaching beekeeping classes, bringing people to the farm who wanted to learn not just technique but philosophy. The connection between pollinator health and crop diversity and soil quality and everything else that made an ecosystem function. The farm had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking alternatives to industrial agriculture. Students came from universities, journalists writing stories about sustainable farming, families wanting their children to understand where food actually came from. Emily led tours, explaining the heritage varieties and the aquifer, and the 4 generations of accumulated knowledge that made it all possible. One afternoon in late October, as the fields turned gold with mature grain ready for harvest, Thomas stood on the hill overlooking the property. From here, he could see everything. The farmhouse where 4 generations had lived and died. The barn holding equipment that represented the best of old knowledge and new technology. The fields growing crops his great-grandfather would recognize, but improved by his grandfather's patient breeding. The silo where Emily preserved seeds that might otherwise be lost forever. Robert joined him, climbing the hill with the careful steps of a man feeling his age. They stood in silence for a while, watching the wind move through the grain like waves on a golden ocean. "We did it," Robert said finally, "against all the odds and everyone who said we couldn't. We survived." "More than survived," Thomas replied. "We proved something. That small farms still have a place. That knowledge matters as much as capital. That legacy is worth fighting for." "Your grandfather knew," Robert said. "That's why he hid those seeds, why he spent all those years documenting everything. He knew a time would come when what he'd preserved would matter again." Thomas nodded, thinking about the letter, about Aunt Margaret's inheritance, about the tractor and the drought, and the moment when everything had seemed lost, about how the pieces had fit together in ways he could never have predicted or planned. "The land remembers," he said, echoing Morrison's phrase, "but only if we remember to listen." As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas thought about the future. Emily would continue the work, would expand the seed library and the preservation efforts, and probably innovate in ways he couldn't imagine. His grandchildren, when they came, would grow up knowing the names of the heritage varieties and the stories of the people who'd preserved them. The land would continue, not unchanged but cared for, improved by each generation that understood their role as stewards rather than owners. The tractor sat in the barn below, the machine that had somehow catalyzed everything. Its purchase a moment of reckless pride that had become a pivot point for transformation. Thomas rarely thought about the dealership anymore, about Brandon Miller's laughter or the humiliation that had driven him to a decision that should have destroyed everything. Because in the end, it hadn't been about the tractor at all. It had been about refusing to accept erasure, about insisting that his life and his land and his family's accumulated knowledge mattered in a world that wanted to reduce everything to efficiency metrics and profit margins. The tractor had just been the visible symbol of an invisible choice: to fight instead of surrender, to believe in possibility instead of accepting defeat, to honor legacy by building upon it rather than just preserving it unchanged. The harvest moon rose over the eastern fields, huge and orange, the kind of moon that makes the land look ancient and eternal. Thomas breathed in the evening air, scented with ripe grain and the last flowers of summer and the dark richness of soil that had been well treated. This smell, this exact combination of elements, existed nowhere else. It was specific to this land, this water, this particular history of care and knowledge and stubborn refusal to give up. He thought about his grandfather, about his father, about all the people who'd worked this soil before him. They weren't perfect. They'd made mistakes, struggled, sometimes failed, but they'd all understood one essential truth: that land is not property to be exploited, but a living system to be understood and respected and carefully tended. And now that responsibility had passed to Emily, who would carry it forward with the same fierce commitment her great-grandfather had shown, but with tools and knowledge he could never have imagined. The legacy wasn't static, frozen in amber. It was alive, evolving, growing stronger with each generation that added their own wisdom to the accumulated store. As darkness settled over the farm, lights came on in the windows of the farmhouse. Sarah moving through the kitchen, Emily probably in her room organizing Morrison's archives, the ordinary rhythms of domestic life playing out in a house that had sheltered 4 generations and would, if they did their work well, shelter many more. Thomas walked down the hill toward home, his boots leaving prints in soil that held the memory of every person who'd walked here before him. The land remembered. It held in its complex chemistry the record of every crop planted, every generation that had tended it, every choice made about what to preserve and what to let go. And walking through the gathering dark, surrounded by fields that represented not just his future, but the future of everyone who believed that small could still matter, that knowledge could compete with capital, that legacy was worth more than any corporation could offer, Thomas Grant understood finally what his grandfather had tried to teach him. The land doesn't belong us. We belong to it. And that belonging, that rootedness in place and history and the patient accumulation of wisdom across generations, that was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any moment of pride that others might call foolish. Because in the end, the story wasn't about a tractor or a dealership, or even about saving a farm. It was about understanding that some things can't be measured in money or efficiency or any of the metrics the modern world uses to assign value. It was about dirt and seeds and water and the stubborn human insistence that connection to place matters, that memory matters, that the work of our ancestors deserves to be honored by continuation and innovation, not just preservation. The stars emerged overhead, the same stars his great-grandfather had navigated by, the same patterns his grandfather had watched while planning the experiments that would preserve genetic diversity for generations unborn. And beneath those ancient lights, on land that held 4 generations of knowledge and love and careful tending, the Grant farm breathed and grew and remembered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.